A gritty Western thriller of deception, justice, and the high cost of a bad deal. Fleeced Trail. Chapter 1. The sign over the door read Harrow Flats, Saloon and Billiards, though nobody had touched a cue ball in that building since the tables felt rotted through 2 winters prior. What remained of the felt hung in strips from the frame, gray as old meat, and the table itself had been shoved against the back wall and piled with crates of rye whiskey and one broken saddle that nobody had claimed. Eldridge Sample came in out of the white afternoon glare and stood at the bar and waited for the barkeep to notice him. The barkeep was a wide man with a neck that had given up on being a neck and simply joined his shoulders, and he was rinsing glasses in brown water and setting them on a board that had never been properly dried in its life. "Whiskey," Sample said. "The decent bottle, not whatever's in the well." The barkeep looked at him. Sample looked back. The barkeep reached under the counter. The glass came down. The whiskey followed. Sample left 2 coins on the bar and carried the glass to a table near the front window where the light came in flat and honest, and he could see the length of the street without turning his head. Harrow Flats ran about 4 blocks in the direction that mattered and tapered into nothing at both ends: a hardware concern, a land office with peeling paint, a Chinese laundry sending up steam into the still air, 2 competing dry goods operations that had apparently been trying to drive each other out of business for so long they'd forgotten how to do anything else. The barber shop had a pole, but no customers. The livery at the south end had a boy out front, moving manure with a flat shovel, working slow in the heat the way boys do when they figure nobody's watching. Sample was 38 years old, and carried his years the way a good rifle carries its use, showing it on the surface but sound beneath. His face was the color of red clay after rain, creased at the corners of the eyes and at the mouth, and his hands on the glass were wide and deliberate. The knuckle of the right index finger thickened and slightly off-angle from an occasion he didn't discuss. He wore a gray canvas shirt and dark trousers and boots that had been resoled once already and would need it again before winter. His hat was the color of smoke. He had ridden into town that morning on a line-backed dun that needed 2 days of good grass, and he had paid for the stall himself and told the livery boy to grain the horse twice and mean it. He had no particular business in Harrow Flats. This was the condition that suited him. He had been a United States Marshal for 11 years out of the Tulsa office and had served his jurisdiction with the kind of dogged precision that either makes a man indispensable to the government or makes him inconvenient, and in Sample's case it had done both. The people who decided such things had eventually decided that what they needed was a man who arrived at the correct conclusions rather than the true ones, and Eldridge Sample had not been that man, and that was that. He had turned in the badge on a Tuesday, walked out into a cold November morning, collected his horse and his effects, and had not been back. He had been working for himself since. Courier jobs, mostly. A little debt collection, where the debt in question was legitimate and the collector wasn't inclined to push beyond what was owed. He'd broken up 2 situations that had been heading toward gunplay, both times by simply standing in a room in a way that made the parties reconsider. He took the work that didn't require him to look away from anything, and he turned down the rest. He was working on his second whiskey when the trouble at the bar started. 2 cowboys had been sitting at the far end since before Sample arrived, nursing their beers with the industrious dedication of men who had no ranch work today, and maybe no ranch work most days. One of them was 20, maybe 22, with a chin that hadn't committed to a beard yet, and a belt buckle the size of a fist. The other was older, maybe 40, with the kind of patience that comes from having made every bad decision there is to make, at least once. The young one had been complaining to the older one about a man named Garrett who owed him $12 from a card game 3 weeks prior. The complaint had escalated through several stages and was now at the stage where voices were up and glasses were being set down hard. "He told me he'd pay me by the end of June," the young one said. "It is the 14th of July." "I know what day it is," the older one said. "You act like $12 isn't $12. I act like Garrett has a brother-in-law with a temper and a Winchester, and I don't care to watch you get yourself shot over $12. He picked up his beer. "That's what I act like." The young one pushed back from the bar and stood up and put his hand on the bar and said something in a lower register that Sample didn't catch. And the older one said something back, and then the young one knocked over his glass. It hit the floor and broke. The barkeep turned from his rinsing and looked at the mess and then at the young cowboy with an expression that had a question in it. "Pick that up," Sample said. Both cowboys looked at him. The room was not large. There were 3 other men at scattered tables, and they all looked too. The young cowboy said, "You talking to me?" "You knocked it over." "Accidents happen." "Man breaks something in another man's establishment," Sample said. "He picks it up. That's not a philosophy, that's just how it works." He had not raised his voice. He was still looking out the window at the street. "Your business with Garrett is your business. Broken glass is everybody's business. Someone walks across it in the dark, they cut their foot. Could be a child." He looked at the cowboy then. "Pick it up." The young cowboy looked at the older one. The older one looked at his beer and offered nothing. The young cowboy bent down and picked up the pieces of glass and set them on the bar. His face was red from the ears down. "Thank you," Sample said and returned to the window. The older cowboy looked at Sample with an expression that was not hostile. It was closer to professional appreciation, the way one skilled tradesman looks at another's work. He finished his beer, put a coin on the bar, stood up, and touched the young cowboy on the arm. "Come on. Let's go find Garrett." They went out. The room settled back into its afternoon quiet. The barkeep went back to his rinsing. Sample got a third whiskey and brought it back to the table and thought about nothing in particular. A freight wagon creaked past on the street, pulled by 2 mules. A woman in a yellow dress came out of the dry goods store on the left and went into the dry goods store on the right, which suggested that particular competition had a clear winner. A dog slept against the base of the hitching post outside the barber's. Then the sheep came. He heard them before he saw them, a sound like water moving through brush, the low mechanical complaint of a large number of animals in motion, and under it the click of hooves on the packed earth of the main street. He leaned forward in his chair. The flock came around the bend at the north end of town in a woolly gray-white mass that spread across the width of the street and pushed to both sides of it, nosing at the gaps between buildings and retreating from them, and moving generally southward with the logic that large groups of animals apply to the problem of forward progress. Sample counted fast. 40-some head, maybe closer to 60. Good-looking animals, not gaunt, with the dense fleece of animals that had been kept properly through winter and spring. Behind them came the wagon. It was a good wagon under its trail grime, a Studebaker, he thought, or something close, with high sideboards painted once in dark red and now faded to the color of dried blood, and patched in 2 places with newer boards that hadn't been painted at all. The wheels were solid. The canvas cover had been replaced recently enough that the seams still showed tight. A man sat on the bench managing 4 horses with the relaxed competence of someone who has been doing it so long the reins have become extensions of his hands. The man was somewhere north of 45 and built square, not heavy but dense, with the kind of weight that settles into a man who has spent his life doing physical work that never quite stops. He had a broad face and a jaw that started under his cheekbones and went straight down to his chin, and dark eyes set deep in the kind of squint that comes from years of watching horizons. He wore a white shirt, gone yellow at the collar, and a flat-brimmed hat with a leather band, and he sat on the bench the way men sit when they're tired but won't acknowledge it. Beside him sat a woman, older or close to it, with her hair pinned up under a light scarf, and her hands folded in her lap over what appeared to be a piece of mending she had given up on for the moment. Her face was the kind of face that had been handsome when she was young, and had kept most of that quality into middle age, though life had done some visible editing. Behind her, in the wagon bed, an old woman sat on a wooden box with a shawl over her shoulders despite the heat, and did not look at the town at all. She was looking at something in the middle distance that nobody else could see. Alongside the wagon, up near the horses, a boy rode a stocky brown mare. He was 16 or thereabouts, dark-haired, with his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, and he rode with his back straight and his chin up in the way of a young man who is aware that people are watching. People were watching. The saloon had gone quiet, in the way rooms go quiet when something interesting happens outside. The barkeep came out from behind the bar and stood near the door. The three other men at the tables pushed back their chairs. One of them, a cattleman in a good hat, stood and went to the window that Sample was already sitting at, and he stood there with his thumbs in his belt and watched the flock move down the street with an expression Sample had seen before on men who had decided to be angry about something and were working out the particulars. "Lord Almighty," the cattleman said. He shook his head with the theatrical sorrow of a man who wants an audience for his sorrow. "You see this? Sheep. Right down Main Street." He looked around the room to collect agreement. Foreign sheep, no less. Nobody answered him, but nobody disagreed either, which the cattleman seemed to take as sufficient. "You know what sheep do to grazing land," he said. He wasn't talking to anyone specific now. "Cut the grass right down to the root. Root system dies, you got nothing but hardpan. They run those animals on open range. Every cattleman in the county loses his summer graze." He sniffed. "And where do they come from, these people? Look at that rig. Look at the way he's dressed. Not from around here." Sample looked at the man on the wagon bench. Petru Vasila, he would not know the name until later, sat straight on his bench and moved his flock down the main street of Harrow Flats with the focused patience of a man who has been told that patience is a virtue and has chosen to take this seriously. He did not look at the people watching from the boardwalks and windows. He looked at the road ahead, at the south end of town, at whatever was beyond it that he had fixed his direction toward. The boy on the mare, André, did look. He looked at every face on the boardwalk with a direct, level gaze that did not go looking for trouble, but didn't step back from it either. He was 16, and he had learned somewhere that you look at things. The woman on the wagon bench looked once at the saloon window, directly at it, directly at the line of faces there, and then looked forward again. Her expression gave nothing away. Whatever she thought of Harrow Flats and its people, she kept it in the wagon with her. "You run sheep on open range next to cattle," the cattleman said. "The cattle won't drink from the same water. You know that. Won't go near it. Sheep foul a water source. Every cow in the area goes thirsty." He tapped the window glass. "Somebody ought to run them back the way they came." "Where are they heading, you think?" one of the other men asked. "Homestead claim, by the look of it. They got that wagon loaded for settling." The cattleman's jaw set. "There's open range east of here that's been grazed by Dunmore's herd for going on 12 years. If some immigrant family files a homestead claim out there and runs woolly pests on it, you'd have to take that up with the land office," Sample said. The cattleman looked down at him. "Excuse me?" "The land office. That's where homestead claims get filed and disputed." You've got a problem with what somebody does on their legal claim. You file a complaint with the land office or the county court. Sample picked up his glass. Running them back the way they came would be a different matter. That'd be interference with lawful movement on a public road, and that's a charge that holds up in front of a judge. He drank. Just so you know where the lines are. The cattleman looked at him for a long moment. You a lawyer? No. Then mind your own business. I'm making it my business, Sample said pleasantly enough. Since you were talking to the room, and I'm in the room. The cattleman looked at Sample's hands on the glass, and then at his eyes, and did the arithmetic that men of experience do in such moments. He went back to his table, and sat down and picked up his beer. The last of the sheep cleared the south end of town. The wagon followed. The boy on the mare followed the wagon. The old woman in the wagon bed had still not looked at the town. Sample watched the rig until it rounded the bend at the south end, and the dust began to settle back onto the street. The dog at the hitching post had not woken up through any of it. He thought about getting a fourth whiskey and decided against it. He had a courier job in the morning, a pouch of land documents to carry to a surveying office 12 miles east, and he liked to start early and ride easy, and he needed his eyes for that. He left a coin on the table and walked out into the late afternoon, which hit him like a wall of brass. The street smelled of dust and manure, and the distant sweetness of the sheep which surprised him. He'd expected something else from that many animals, but the smell they'd left behind was almost pleasant, like lanolin and cut grass. He stood on the boardwalk and rolled a cigarette and lit it, and looked south at the bend where the wagon had gone. Behind him, inside the saloon, he heard the cattleman's voice again, lower now, talking to someone. Then a second voice he hadn't heard before. Then both voices dropped beneath what the street noise would carry. Sample smoked his cigarette down to his fingers and pitched the stub into the street and went to find his supper. Behind him, the saloon door opened and closed. Two men came out onto the boardwalk. They did not go to the diner. They went to the livery. Fleeced Trail. Chapter 2. The courier pouch sat on the table beside his bed, and Sample looked at it in the dark for a while before he went to sleep. It was a leather satchel, ox blood red, with a brass clasp and a government seal stamped into the flap. The surveying office that wanted it was called Meridian Land and Survey, and it operated out of a town called Cray, which was 12 miles east on the same road the sheep had taken. The man who had hired him, a clerk in a string tie named Beaumont, who worked the territorial land office 2 doors down from the saloon, had handed over the pouch with the care of a man passing off something fragile. Gets there by Thursday noon, Beaumont had said. It's Tuesday, Sample said. I know what day it is. Beaumont had adjusted his string tie, the way men adjust things when they're nervous. There's documents in there that have a bearing on several pending claims. Time-sensitive documents. You understand what I mean by time-sensitive. I understand what the words mean, Sample said. I mean specifically that if those documents don't arrive by Thursday noon, the window on certain filings closes, and we're looking at a 6-month delay on. Beaumont stopped himself. Just get it there by Thursday noon. What's the pay? $4. Sample had looked at the pouch, and then at Beaumont and said, 6. Beaumont said 5, and Sample said fine, and took the pouch and the $5, and gone to find a meal and a bed in that order. The meal had been adequate. A boarding house 2 streets over, a woman named Mrs. Aldicoa, who ran a tight operation and charged 40 cents for supper and 20 for a room, and brooked no noise after 9. Sample had eaten salt pork and white beans and a wedge of cornbread that was better than it had any right to be. And he'd gone upstairs and taken off his boots and lain on top of the coverlet in the August heat, and looked at the courier pouch on the table until his eyes closed. He was up before first light. Mrs. Aldicoa had coffee going when he came downstairs, which elevated her considerably in his estimation. He drank 2 cups, standing at the kitchen counter, and ate a cold biscuit from the previous night, and left 60 cents on the counter, and went out into the gray pre-dawn of Harrow Flats. The street held the particular stillness of early morning in a small town, not silence, but the absence of human noise, which is different. The wind moved through the gaps between buildings, and pushed a tin can along the boardwalk in front of the hardware store, and let it go. A rooster somewhere behind the laundry announced itself with the conviction of an animal who believes this is news. Sample saddled the dun in the near dark of the livery, while the stable boy slept in the hay of the far stall with his boots still on. The dun stood patient and cooperative in the way of horses that have been well treated and know what saddling means. Sample checked the cinch twice, adjusted the stirrups, hung the courier pouch on the saddle horn, and led the horse out into the street. He mounted and turned south, and then east at the bend, onto the road the sheep had taken the afternoon before. The eastern road out of Harrow Flats ran through 8 miles of rolling scrubland, before it descended into a broad creek valley where the soil went dark, and the vegetation thickened, and the road itself turned from hardpan to a soft pale dust that held hoofprints with forensic precision. Cottonwoods grew along the creek banks, and in late summer they were going gold at the tips, just starting, the first announcement of what was coming. The creek itself ran low in August. You could cross it in 3 places without getting your stirrups wet, but it ran, which was the important thing out here. Water running meant the valley stayed green a month longer than the scrubland behind it, and 2 months longer than the hardpan to the north. It was good land. Sample had noticed this the first time he'd ridden the road, 2 days prior coming in from the east, and he noticed it again now going back. He had a lawman's habit of cataloging terrain, exits, approaches, sightlines, the geography of cover and exposure. Good land meant people wanted it. People wanting the same piece of land was the oldest engine of trouble there was. He was 4 miles out of town when he smelled the smoke. Not campfire smoke. Campfire smoke has a breakfast quality, wood and coffee and possibility. This was different, heavier, with an oily undertone that put something cold in the back of his throat. He knew the smell. He had known it since a farm outside Muskogee, in the 3rd year of his time with the marshal's office, when he had ridden up on a homestead that 3 men had burned to the ground with the family still inside it, and the smell of that day had attached itself to some permanent part of his memory and never left. He touched the dun's flanks, and the horse moved into a canter. The smoke came from the creek crossing at the 4.5-mile mark, where the road dipped down through a stand of cottonwoods and crossed the water on a natural shelf of flat limestone. He saw the column of it through the trees before he saw the source, gray-black, the kind of smoke that comes from cloth and wood and leather, not from green timber, and he pulled the dun back to a walk 30 yards out and came in slow with his right hand loose at his side. The wagon sat at the edge of the creek. It had burned from the inside out, the canvas gone entirely, the iron hoops of the cover framework standing bare and black against the morning sky like the ribs of something enormous that had died here. The sideboards were mostly gone on the right side. The left side boards still stood, though they were charred through and would crumble if you touched them. The wheels had burned to the iron rims. The wagon bed had collapsed onto the limestone shelf and lay in a heap of black timber and ash and the melted and twisted remains of the things the family had carried with them. Pots, tools, a clock, something that might have been a child's chair, the iron mechanism of a sewing machine that had survived the fire because iron survives everything. The horses were gone. Sample sat the dun at the edge of the cottonwoods and looked at the scene the way he had been trained to look at scenes, not at the thing that demanded his attention first, but at the perimeter of it. The road behind him, empty. The road ahead, bending east into the scrubland, empty. The creek to his left, running shallow over the limestone, nothing moving in the water or along its banks. The tree line on the far side of the crossing, cottonwoods and some willow scrub, no movement in the branches. He rode forward. WesteFLEECED lay on the near side of the creek, face down on the limestone shelf 6 feet from the water's edge. He had fallen forward and come to rest with his right arm beneath him and his left arm extended, the fingers of his left hand trailing in the shallow current. He had been shot twice, once in the back, high, and once in the back of the head at close range, the second shot delivered after he had already gone down. The white shirt he'd worn on the wagon bench, the one gone yellow at the collar, had soaked through and gone a color that had nothing civil about it. Sample dismounted and ground-hitched the dun, and crouched beside the man and looked at him for a long moment without touching anything. 40-some years old. Broad hands with callus across the palm, and on the inside of the right thumb from years of rain work and tool work. A plain gold band on the left ring finger. His boots were good boots, resoled like Sample's own, and the heels were worn on the outside edge in the way of a man who has spent his life on uneven ground. He stood up and looked around the creek site. Marta Vasile lay on the upstream side of the wagon, between the burned frame and the cottonwood tree closest to the water. She had made it further than her husband, or had started from a different place, and there were drag marks in the soft soil at the creek's edge that told him she had pulled herself toward the water after she'd been hit. She had not made it. One shot, the entry wound at the left side of the chest, which meant she had been facing them when it happened. She had been looking at the men who killed her. Sample stood very still with his hat in his hands for a moment. Then he put his hat back on and kept working the scene. The old woman, the grandmother, who had sat on her wooden box in the wagon bed with her shawl and her private distance, was 10 feet behind the wagon on the roadside, in the grass at the edge of the cottonwood shade. She lay on her side with her knees drawn up and her hands clasped at her chest, fingers laced together. And if you had come upon her in a different context, you might have thought she was sleeping. She had been shot once. The rosary she'd been holding had come apart, and its beads lay scattered in the grass around her, small dark oblongs of polished wood. Sample collected the beads one by one and placed them in his shirt pocket. He did not know why he did this. He did it anyway. He read the site the way a man reads a page, systematically, nothing skipped. Multiple shooters. He put the number at 3, possibly 4. The angle of entry on WesteFLEECED's back shot suggested a shooter positioned at the upstream tree line, elevated slightly, maybe standing on the creek bank where it rose a foot above the shelf. The close-range shot to the head was from a different angle, suggesting a second man who had come forward after the first volley. Marta's wound was a third angle entirely, coming from the roadside, from someone who had positioned himself behind the wagon while the family's attention went to the creek bank. They had set it up in advance. This was not an opportunistic ambush, not road agents who had spotted a wagon and decided to try their luck. The positions were deliberate. Someone had ridden this road before the family arrived, chosen the creek crossing because the cottonwoods provided concealment on 3 sides, and the crossing itself slowed a wagon to a walk, and placed their men accordingly. The strong box sat in the grass, 8 feet from the wagon's remains. Someone had dragged it clear of the fire, or had removed it before setting the fire, which was the more likely sequence. The hasp had been broken open with something heavy, probably a rifle butt, and the lid stood open at a right angle. Sample looked inside without touching the box. Empty. No, not empty. He crouched and looked more carefully. A few coins, copper, not silver, in the left corner of the box, the kind of coins that fall through the gaps in a man's planning. A folded paper, pale blue, that had been pressed against the bottom and been overlooked or dismissed. He took the paper out with 2 fingers and unfolded it. A letter, in a language he didn't read. He could make out a few words of the address at the top, something ending in ESCU, a place name he didn't recognize, and at the bottom, a signature with a family resemblance to the name on the homestead claim that Beaumont had referenced. He folded the letter carefully and put it in his breast pocket beside the rosary beads. He stood and looked at the empty strongbox and thought about what Beaumont had said. Documents that have a bearing on several pending claims. Beaumont, with his string tie and his nervousness and his insistence on Thursday noon. The land office, 2 doors down from the saloon, where the cattleman with the good hat had talked about running immigrants back the way they came. He thought about all of this without drawing a conclusion, because conclusions drawn too fast harden into shapes that the evidence has to fit, and he had seen enough investigations go sideways that way. He walked the perimeter of the crossing. On the far bank, in the soft soil above the limestone shelf, he found the hoof prints he expected, 3 horses shod, their prints deep in the going in and lighter coming out, which meant they'd stood there a while before the wagon arrived and left at speed afterward. He followed the outgoing tracks 20 yards up the far bank before they hit hardpan and disappeared. On the near side, in the grass behind where the old woman lay, he found the shell casings. 6 of them, .44 to .40 caliber, scattered in a rough line that matched the position of the roadside shooter. He picked up each one and turned it in his fingers. The primer strike was clean and slightly off-center, consistent, which meant all 6 had come from the same weapon. The case mouths showed a particular crimp that he recognized, a handloader's crimp, tighter than factory, the kind you got when a man was loading his own ammunition to a specific spec. Factory loads from any manufacturer showed a more open crimp. This was custom work. He knew one man in the territory who loaded .44 to .40 shells to that spec. A man named Birch, who operated a trading post, an informal gunsmith operation, out of a settlement called Tule Springs, 30 miles southeast. Birch sold his custom loads to a small, loyal clientele who liked the extra powder charge and were willing to pay for the consistency. Sample had bought a box from him once, 3 years back, and the crimp was identical to what he held in his hand now. He did not draw a conclusion. He noted the fact and kept moving. The sheep were gone. He had expected this. A flock of 60 animals does not sit calmly beside a burning wagon and the sound of gunfire. They would have scattered in every direction the moment the shooting started, pushed through the creek, spread into the scrubland on both sides of the road. Some of them would run until they found water and grass and stopped. Some of them would keep going until something stopped them. In this country, most of them would be dead within a week from dehydration or predators or simply the hard arithmetic of animals not built for desert. He found 3 of them in the cottonwoods downstream, standing together in the shade with their heads down, the particular posture of animals that have been badly frightened and have no framework for processing it. They looked at him with their strange, pale eyes when he pushed through the brush, and one of them made a sound low in its throat, and then they went back to standing. He left them. There was nothing to be done about the sheep right now. He went back to the wagon and stood in the ash smell of it and thought about the boy. Andre Vasile had been riding the brown mare alongside the wagon when Sample last saw him. 16 years old, straight-backed, looking at every face on the boardwalk with that direct and unapologetic gaze. He was not among the dead at the creek crossing. Sample had checked every foot of the site twice. No blood trail leading away from the main scene, except for the drag marks Marta had left going toward the water. No signs of a second body having been moved. 3 possibilities. The boy had been taken. For what purpose Sample didn't want to think through yet. The boy had escaped, run or ridden when the shooting started, gotten clear before the shooters could account for him. Or the boy had not been at the crossing when it happened, had ridden ahead or fallen behind for some reason, and come back to find this, and then run. Of these, the second and third were the ones he held on to. He walked the downstream bank for a quarter-mile, reading the mud and the soft soil at the water's edge. At the 100-yard mark he found what he was looking for, the prints of a shod horse, smaller hooved than a working ranch animal, the spacing of the stride suggesting a horse moving fast. The prints went into the water, and he waded across, 20 feet wide and calf-deep at the center, and picked them up on the far bank going northeast, away from the road, into the scrubland. He followed them 50 yards, until the ground hardened, and the prints went thin and intermittent, and finally stopped giving him anything useful. The horse and rider had gone northeast. He stood at the edge of the scrubland, and looked in that direction. Nothing there but sun and distance, and the blue suggestion of a mesa on the far horizon. He went back to the dun. He should have ridden to Cray and delivered the pouch, and sent word back to Harrow Flats, and let the machinery of the law do what the machinery of the law was designed to do. This was the clean version of his morning. The version that cost him nothing but his peace of mind, which he had learned to treat as a renewable resource. He sat on the dun at the edge of the crossing, and looked at the burned wagon and the 3 bodies and the scattered rosary beads that he had put in his pocket without knowing why. He thought about Sheriff Collis, who drank his evenings with the cattlemen in the saloon, and whose office was 2 doors down from Bowman's land office, who had not appeared at any point during the previous afternoon's commotion, despite the fact that 60 sheep and a wagon coming down Main Street would have been visible and audible from anywhere in Harrow Flats, including the sheriff's office window. He thought about Beaumont, and his string tie and his time-sensitive documents with a bearing on several pending claims. He thought about 2 men walking out of the saloon after dark and going to the livery. Then he stopped thinking about the clean version of his morning. He dismounted and went to work. He spent an hour doing what he could for the dead, which was not much and was also the only thing. He had no tools for burial, no shovel, nothing, and the limestone shelf gave him nothing to work with. He dragged the 3 bodies to the shade of the largest cottonwood, and laid them out straight and covered them with his bedroll canvas, which was not adequate and was what he had. He weighted the canvas at the corners with stones from the creek bed. He took his hat off and stood over them for a moment, and said nothing out loud because nothing that could be said out loud was equal to what had happened here, and the creek ran over the limestone shelf with the small, indifferent sound of water that has no opinion about anything. He put his hat back on. He remounted and looked east down the road toward Cray and the surveying office, and Thursday noon and Bowman's $5. He unhooked the courier pouch from the saddle horn, and opened his saddlebag and put it inside. He would get the documents there. He would do the job he had agreed to do. But he would do it in the order that made sense, and right now the order that made sense ran northeast, after a boy on a brown mare. The scrubland northeast of the creek crossing was a hard country to move through, low desert scrub, mesquite, and prickly pear, and the occasional stand of cedar, all of it roughly hip-high on a mounted man and providing cover in the sense that it broke up sightlines without providing anything you could actually hide behind. The ground ran uneven, cut with shallow arroyos that appeared without warning, and required the dun to pick its way carefully, and the sun climbed the sky and began to press down on everything with real intent. Sample rode slow and quartered the ground ahead of him in sections, looking for sign. At the 2-mile mark he found where the brown mare had stumbled in an arroyo, the scuff marks of a horse catching itself, the deep press of hooves where it had lunged up the far bank, and at 3 miles he found a place where the rider had stopped. The mare's prints went tight and circular, the pattern of an animal being held in place, and in the soft soil at the arroyo's edge he found boot prints. The rider had dismounted. The boot was small, narrow-heeled, not a cowboy boot. The depth of the print was slight, consistent with a light person. The right boot print showed a slight outward roll at the toe, the kind of wear pattern that develops over years and tells you something about how a person stands. The rider had stood here for a while, looking back toward the creek crossing, looking back at the smoke. Then the boot prints went back to the horse, and the horse prints went northeast again. He pushed on. He found the brown mare first, standing in the shade of a cedar thicket at the base of a low ridge, reins trailing, still saddled. The horse turned its head and watched him approach with large, calm eyes. It had been ridden hard and then left here, and it was not happy about the situation, but it had found shade and was managing. Sample stopped the dun 20 feet out and sat still for a moment. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, to the general area of the cedar thicket. "I'm not one of them. My name is Eldridge Sample. I was in the saloon yesterday afternoon when your family came through town. I came out this morning on the eastern road and found the crossing." He paused. "I covered them with what I had." Nothing moved in the cedar thicket. "You've got two choices," Sample said. "You stay in those cedars and wait for whoever comes next, which might be me again or might not be. Or you come out and tell me what you saw, and we work out what happens after that." He rested both hands on the saddle horn where they could be seen. "I'm not law. I'm not connected to anyone in Harrow Flats. I have no reason to be out here, except that I found your family at the crossing, and I followed the tracks of your horse." The cedars moved. Not the wind. The wind had died an hour ago, and the air sat flat and hot over everything. The boy came out of the thicket. He had lost his hat somewhere, and his dark hair was matted with sweat and stuck to his forehead and the side of his face. His left sleeve was torn at the shoulder, and beneath the tear, his upper arm was wrapped with a strip of cloth cut from the shirt's tail, tight enough to be a proper pressure bandage, which told Sample that the boy had some practical knowledge and had kept his head when his head had every reason to go elsewhere. The cloth was dark with dried blood at the center, but the bleeding had stopped. A graze, or close to it. He was 16 years old, and he had been through something that men twice his age did not always come through intact. And he stood at the edge of the cedar thicket and looked at Sample with the same direct, unblinking gaze he'd used on the boardwalk of Harrow Flats. Except that now there was something behind the gaze that the boardwalk version hadn't needed. "You covered them," the boy said. His English was careful, each word placed with precision, the accent of a language where consonants carry more weight than they do in American speech. "With my bedroll canvas. It's not enough. They need burying. I didn't have what I needed to do that." The boy looked at the ground between them for a moment. Then he looked back up. "How many men?" Sample said. It came out flat, not a question exactly, more the beginning of an accounting. "3," the boy said. "One on the far bank, in the trees. One behind the wagon on the roadside. One more, further back on the road, holding the horses." He touched his arm. "The one on the bank shot first. My father," he stopped. He breathed through his nose and started again. "My father was down before I could do anything. I rode northeast, away from the road. The one from the bank came after me, but his horse was tied, and he was slow getting to it, and I had a head start." He paused. "He got close enough to shoot once." "That's when you took the graze?" "Yes." "Did you see their faces?" The boy looked at him steadily. "Yes. All three. Too clearly. The one who held the horses I saw from further away. But I would know him." He said this with a flatness that had nothing juvenile in it. "I would know all of them." Sample looked at the boy for a long moment. The arm would need cleaning and a proper dressing. The boy needed water and food and probably sleep, though sleep was going to be a complicated proposition for some time to come. And Sample needed the faces and anything else the boy carried behind those careful eyes. "All right," Sample said. "Here's what we're going to do right now. You're going to drink some water from my canteen, and we're going to look at that arm, and then we're going to ride." He reached back and unhooked the canteen from his saddle. "We're not going back to Harrow Flats." The boy caught the canteen. "Where then?" "East," Sample said. "I've got a delivery to make." The boy looked at him. "After that," Sample said, "we'll talk about what comes next." The boy drank. He drank with discipline. 2 long pulls, and then he stopped and recapped the canteen and handed it back, the water discipline of someone who had been told about water in dry country and taken the lesson seriously. He looked at Sample over the canteen. "My name is Andre," he said. "I know," Sample said. "I heard your mother use it when you were coming through town." He took the canteen back and hooked it on the saddle. "Come on then. Let's get that arm looked at and get off this ground." Andre Vasile went to the brown mare and gathered her reins and mounted in one motion, the movement of a boy who had been riding since he could reach the stirrups. He settled in the saddle and looked east, the direction Sample had said, and then he looked back northwest, back toward the creek crossing and the cottonwood shade and the bedroll canvas and what was under it. He looked for a long time. Then he turned the mare east and rode. Fleeced Trail. Chapter 3. "You're bleeding through your shirt," Andre said. Sample looked down. The boy was right. A dark oval had spread through the gray canvas on his left side, low on the ribs, and he had been so occupied with the road and the heat and the weight of what he was carrying in his breast pocket that he hadn't felt it start. He pressed his hand against the spot and felt the familiar hot, wet pulse of a wound that had reopened. The cut he'd taken 3 days ago from a fence wire he hadn't seen in the pre-dawn dark of the livery yard. He'd tied it off with his bandana that morning and had apparently failed to tie it tight enough. "It'll keep," he said. Andre looked at him the way the boy had of looking at things, straight on, measuring. "My mother used to say that about things that did not keep." Sample said nothing to that. They rode on. Cray announced itself first as a water tower, white-painted and already going gray on the south side, rising above the scrubland with the self-important height of civic infrastructure. Then a windmill, then the roofline of a grain elevator, then the town itself materializing out of the afternoon haze the way towns do out here all at once, as if someone had set it down while you weren't watching. It was bigger than Harrow Flats, a real main street with 2-story false fronts, a proper hotel with a covered gallery, a feed and grain operation with a loading dock and a scale, a barbershop that appeared to have actual customers. The railroad had come through Cray 7 years prior and left the usual improvements, a depot, a stockyard at the south end, a saloon that had been built twice as large as the town originally needed and had grown into it. They rode in at 3 in the afternoon, both of them trail dusty and quiet, the kind of quiet that settles between 2 people who have been through something together and have agreed without discussing it to hold off on processing it until the immediate business is done. Sample found a doctor first. The doctor's office occupied the ground floor of a 2-story frame building on a side street off the main, the sign above the door reading Dr. Callum Price, physician and surgeon, in letters that had been painted by someone with more enthusiasm than skill. The office smelled of carbolic and old leather, and the particular stale warmth of rooms where sick people wait. A woman in a gray dress sat behind a small desk and looked at them over her spectacles. "He needs that arm looked at," Sample said, nodding at Andre. Gunshot graze, maybe 30 hours old. He dressed it himself in the field. The woman took her spectacles off and looked more carefully at the boy. Then she stood up. "Come on back," she said. "Both of you, by the look of it." Dr. Price was a compact man in his 50s with close-cropped white hair and the kind of unhurried precision in his hands that comes from years of working on things that bleed if you rush them. He cleaned Andre's arm, rebandaged it with proper linen and spirits, and pronounced the graze clean. The bullet had taken a furrow of skin and muscle along the outside of the bicep without touching bone or major vessel, which the doctor described as the boy's good fortune, in a tone that suggested he'd seen the other version often enough. He gave Andre a small bottle of laudanum and told him to take 10 drops if the pain made sleep impossible, and no more than that. Then he looked at Sample's side. "Fence wire," Sample said. "Fence wire," the doctor said, in the voice of a man who has heard many explanations and ranks them by plausibility. He cleaned the cut, which had opened a 2-inch line along the lower left ribs and was deeper than Sample had been prepared for when the lamplight hit it directly. 3 stitches, gut thread, tied with the tidy efficiency of a man who charged by the case and not by the suture. He taped a square of clean cotton over it and told Sample to keep it dry for 5 days, which they both understood was more of a professional aspiration than a realistic expectation. $1.50 for the both of you, the doctor said. $1 for the boy, 4 bits for the wire. Sample paid him, and they went out. Meridian Land and Survey occupied a narrow storefront on the main street between a hardware dealer and an insurance broker, the kind of business that generates paper and files it, and generates more paper and needs a large amount of shelf space for all the paper it generates. The front window was stenciled with the company name, and below it, in smaller letters, surveys, claims, title searches, plats. A bell above the door announced Sample and Andre when they came in. The man who came out from the back was not what Sample had expected, though he hadn't shaped a specific expectation. He was young, 26, 27, with sandy hair cut short, and a good suit that had seen real use, and an ink stain on the outside of the right-hand middle finger that no amount of washing had fully resolved. He looked at the courier pouch on Sample's arm, and something in his face went from professional to relieved. "That's from Beaumont," he said. "Not a question." "Meridian Land and Survey," Sample said. "I've got a delivery for a Thursday noon deadline, and it's Wednesday afternoon, so you're in good shape." The young man took the pouch and looked at the seal and the clasp, checking both with the attention of someone who has been waiting for this particular item for long enough that he wants to confirm it's actually here. "I'm Fenn," he said. "I run the Cray office. You want to sign the delivery ledger?" "Sure." Fenn set the pouch on the counter and went behind it and produced a ledger, and Sample signed it. Andre stood near the door and looked at the shelves of rolled survey maps and plat books and said nothing. Sample put the pen down. "What's in the pouch?" Fenn looked up from the ledger. "Excuse me?" "I'm asking what's in the pouch." Beaumont was cagey about it. Man gets cagey about a courier job. I start to wonder why. That's between Beaumont and this office. Beaumont's land office is 2 doors down from a saloon where a cattleman named Dunmore runs his mouth about immigrant homesteaders on the eastern range. Sample put both hands flat on the counter. "I rode the eastern road this morning and found a family 3 days out of Harrow Flats, camped at a creek crossing. They'd been shot. Mother, father, grandmother. 3 of them. The family had a homestead claim on land in this county, and the claim papers were in their strongbox, and the strongbox was empty when I found it." He watched Fenn. "So I'm asking again. What's in the pouch?" Fenn had gone still the way people go still when they absorb information that reorganizes the furniture of their understanding. He looked at the courier pouch on the counter. Then he looked at Andre by the door. "That's the boy," Fen said. "That's the boy," Sample said. Fen put both hands on the counter and looked at the ledger and appeared to make a decision. The pouch contains boundary survey records for a water rights filing on Cray Creek and its tributaries. Somebody has been trying to block that filing for 8 months. Every time we get close to the window, documents go missing or get delayed, or the courier doesn't show. He paused. Beaumont is on our side of this. He's been trying to get these records to us before someone finds a way to pull the filing window closed again. Fen looked at Sample steadily. There's a land agent out of the county seat named Cray who has been running an acquisition campaign on the Eastern Range for 3 years. He buys up grazing leases and pressures homestead claims until people give up or move on. If this water rights filing goes through, it establishes a legal precedent that breaks up his operation from the inside. He paused again. He would go to some lengths to prevent that. "Some lengths," Sample said. "Yes." "Give me his full name," Sample said. "Hollis Cray. He operates out of a town called Morrow, county seat, 20 miles north of here." Sample looked at the pouch on the counter. "You'll get that filed today. First thing in the morning. The county recorder opens at 8. "Today," Sample said. "Tonight, if you have to knock on somebody's door. I don't want that filing sitting in your office overnight." Fen looked at him for a moment, and then nodded and reached for the pouch. They took a room at the hotel, 1 room, 2 beds, Sample paying without discussion, and Sample sent Andre upstairs with the room key and a plate of food from the hotel kitchen, and instructions to bolt the door and open it for nobody but Sample, and he described what his knock would sound like, 3 short and 2 slow, so there'd be no ambiguity. The boy took the food and the key and went upstairs without argument, which told Sample something about how tired he was. Then Sample went back out into the evening street and stood on the gallery of the hotel and looked north toward the county seat he couldn't see from here, and thought about Hollis Cray. A land agent. A man who worked with paper and leverage and the accumulated weight of a legal system that moved slow enough to be manipulated by someone patient and well-financed. The kind of man who kept his hands clean by ensuring that the men who did the dirty work on his behalf were not the kind of men anyone would believe if they talked. He had known a dozen versions of Hollis Cray in his years with the marshal's office. They were the hardest cases because they were never at the scene. They were always in an office somewhere, or at a dinner table, or in a hotel room in a city 300 miles away. And between them and the bodies, there were always 2 or 3 or 4 men who could be described as independent contractors, men who made decisions on their own recognizance, men whose employer could not reasonably be held responsible for what independent men chose to do with their time. He went back inside and found the saloon and sat at the bar and ordered a beer and nursed it and thought. He took the blue letter out of his breast pocket and unfolded it on the bar top. The writing was precise and small, a European hand that angled slightly to the left, and the language was not Spanish and not French and not anything he recognized, which meant it was almost certainly the family's native tongue. Romanian, Fen had said when Sample described them. He looked at the address at the top of the letter and at the signature at the bottom, and he took from his other breast pocket the 6 shell casings he had collected at the creek crossing and set them in a row on the bar beside the letter, and he looked at both of them. The casings were the thread that led somewhere specific. Birch at Tule Springs, 30 miles southeast of Harrow Flats, which put it 40-some miles southwest of where Sample sat now. 2 days' ride if he pushed. He needed to get there before whoever had sent those men learned that the job was incomplete, that Andre Vasile had ridden northeast and survived, and sent word to Birch to expect company. He refolded the letter and pocketed it and the casings, and finished his beer, and went back to the hotel. He woke Andre at first light, which the boy handled without complaint, and with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had spent his life waking before dawn to work. They ate in the hotel dining room, eggs and salt pork and coffee, the boy eating with focused purpose, refilling his plate once without being told it was acceptable. Sample watched him, and thought about the 10-drop bottle of laudanum in the boy's shirt pocket, and the fact that it appeared untouched. "Tell me about the man who came after you," Sample said. "The one from the creek bank." Andre set his fork down. He was not young. 40, maybe. He had a long face. Pale for this climate. Like a man who works indoors and only comes outside for particular things. He picked up his coffee. His horse was gray, almost white. A big animal. His coat was dark canvas, brown or black, and he wore it open. I saw his face when he came out of the trees, before he got to his horse. I was already riding by then, but I looked back. You looked back while someone was shooting at you. My father said you look at things, Andre said. Even when it is hard to look. Especially then. Sample looked at his coffee. The second man, the one on the roadside, I did not see him until after. When I was riding away, I looked back, and he had come out from behind the wagon. He was shorter than the first man. Heavier. He wore a brown hat with a flat brim, and he held his rifle at his side like it was a thing he carried often. Andre paused. He watched me ride. He didn't try to shoot. He just watched. Like he was memorizing. And the third. Further back on the road, 50 yards maybe. Holding 4 horses, the 3 riding horses and one I didn't recognize. A pack horse, I think. He was sitting on the road, like he was waiting for something to finish. Andre's jaw set. He had red hair. I could see it from 50 yards. Very red, like copper wire. Could he see your face from there? The boy thought about it. Yes, he said. I think yes. Sample nodded. 3 men with faces the boy could identify, and who could identify the boy in return. He had understood this since the cedar thicket, but hearing it laid out with this precision made it more concrete and more urgent. We're going to ride west today, Sample said. Not back to Harrow Flats. Southwest. There's a settlement called Tule Springs I need to reach. We'll be off the main road most of the way. He poured more coffee. You'll stay at a place I know there while I run something down. A widow named Clara Esterhuisen runs a small cattle operation 6 miles outside Tule Springs. She's a practical woman, and she doesn't ask questions she doesn't need answers to, and she's a better shot than most men I've known. You trust her, Andre said. I do. The boy nodded once. Accepting this the same way he accepted everything Sample told him, not without evaluation, but without unnecessary pushback. He had a European boy's respect for competent adults, who demonstrated they knew what they were doing. And Sample had demonstrated enough to earn provisional trust. They rode out before 7. Tule Springs sat in a hollow between 2 limestone ridges where an underground spring surfaced and ran south for a quarter mile before losing itself in the scrub, and the settlement that had grown up around it had the temporary look of a place that knew it existed at the pleasure of the water and tried not to make too many permanent commitments. A trading post, a blacksmith, 8 or 10 houses in various stages of construction or decline, and Birch's operation at the north end where the spring came up strongest. Birch's was a trading post in the way that a hardware store is a trading post. It sold goods, yes, but what it really sold was Birch's judgment about those goods and about everything else that came through the door. Abel Birch had been operating at Tule Springs for 11 years, which in this part of the territory made him an institution. He knew who came through, what they carried, what they needed, and what they were willing to pay. He knew the land for 40 miles in any direction with the intimacy of a man who has walked most of it. He knew guns the way a musician knows instruments, not just function but character, the particular voice each one had, what it could do, and what you were asking it to do when you pushed past its nature. He also loaded his own ammunition, and had done so for 20 years, and his crimp was his crimp the way a man's signature is his signature. Sample left Andre with Clara Esterhuisen, a wide-shouldered woman in her 50s with sun-darkened skin and gray-streaked hair, and a Springfield rifle she carried with the casual ease of a woman for whom it was simply another tool, and rode the 6 miles into Tule Springs alone. He tied the dun at Birch's hitching rail at mid-morning and went inside. The trading post smelled of gun oil and dried meat, and the mineral edge of the spring water that ran in a channel under the back wall of the building. Shelves ran floor to ceiling on 3 sides, stocked with the dense practicality of a man who thought about what people actually needed. Birch himself sat on a stool behind the counter, working a leather strap through a cleaning rod on a disassembled rifle action, and he looked up when Sample came in. Abel Birch was 60 and looked 50 and moved like 45. He had a narrow face under a wide hat, and small, careful eyes the color of creek water, and he wore an apron over his clothes that had absorbed enough gun oil over the years to be essentially waterproof. He set the rifle action down. "Sample," he said. Not a greeting, exactly. More an acknowledgement of a fact. "Birch." Sample put the 6 shell casings on the counter in a line. "These yours?" Birch looked at them without touching. He leaned forward on his stool and looked at the crimp and the primer strike, and then he leaned back. "Where'd you find them?" "Creek crossing on the eastern road out of Harrow Flats. 4 miles east of town. You know the spot, limestone shelf, cottonwoods on both banks." "I know it. Family got ambushed there. 3 dead. Those casings were left by the man who worked the roadside of the crossing." Sample watched him. "Your crimp, Birch." Birch looked at the casings for a long moment. Something moved behind his creek water eyes and settled. "I load for about a dozen men on a regular basis," he said. "And maybe another dozen occasional. I don't keep records of who buys what." "You keep records of everything," Sample said. "That's the whole point of you." Birch was quiet. "I'm not law," Sample said. "I'm not here to put anything in front of a judge. I'm here because 3 people are dead under a cottonwood tree at a creek crossing, and the boy who survived them is 6 miles from here, and I need to know who pulled the trigger before whoever sent those men figures out the job was only 2/3 done." He put his hands flat on the counter. "Give me a name, Birch. One name. The man who bought .40 loads from you in the last 30 days." Birch picked up one of the casings and turned it between his fingers. He set it back in line. "There was a man came in 3 weeks ago," he said. "Bought 4 boxes of .44 to 40, my load. Paid cash. Called himself Cale, no last name offered. Long face, pale. Big gray horse. The man from the creek bank. The one who had come out of the trees and chased Andre northeast and put a bullet close enough to take a strip off the boy's arm. He say where he was headed. North. Said he had work up toward Harrow Flats. You see him since?" "No." "Where does a man named Cale go after a job north of here? Where does that type go to wait?" Birch considered this with the care of a man who understands that the answer has consequences. "There's a town called Pelaford, 20 miles north on the Cray Road. It's got a livery and a saloon and 2 boarding houses and not much else. Men who are between one thing and the next tend to collect there. Sample straightened up and reached across the counter and collected the casings and pocketed them. "I'm going to need a box of .45 Colt," he said. "And whatever you've got for trail food that doesn't weigh much." Pella Ford was everything Birch had described, and precisely nothing more. The main street was 2 blocks of frame buildings bookended by open scrubland, and the scrubland had the better of the argument. The livery sat at the south end, with its doors open and the smell of horses and straw coming out into the afternoon. The saloon occupied the center of the west side, Ford's painted above the door in plain block letters that had given up on embellishment. Sample came in from the south at 4 in the afternoon, the sun behind him, and at an angle that put the main street in partial shadow. He rode the length of it at a walk, reading the storefronts and the gallery and the 3 horses hitched in front of Ford's saloon. One of them was a gray, almost white, a large animal with good lines and a well-kept coat. It stood at the rail with the confident stillness of a horse that gets fed regularly and knows it. Sample rode past and tied the dun at the boarding house rail 50 yards further on and walked back. Ford's was dim inside, the way afternoon saloons are dim when they've been closed up against the heat, and the light comes in only through the gap above the batwings and through a single window on the east wall that someone had painted half opaque with whitewash a long time ago. 4 tables, a bar that ran the length of the back wall, a barkeep in a collarless shirt, and 3 men, 1 at a table alone near the window, 2 at the bar. The man at the table near the window had a long face and pale skin for this climate, and he was working on a whiskey and reading a week-old newspaper with the focused attention of a man who has read it several times already and is looking for something he missed. Sample went to the bar and ordered a beer and carried it to a table 1 removed from the pale man's and sat down. The pale man did not look up from his newspaper. He turned a page. He had big hands, Sample noticed, with prominent knuckles, and a scar that ran from the base of his right thumb to the wrist that was old enough to be white against his pale skin. His coat hung on the back of his chair, and his hat sat on the table beside his glass. He had a .44-40 on his hip, in a plain holster with the tie down loose, worn on the left side, butt forward, the cross-draw configuration. Sample drank his beer. After a while, the pale man reached the end of his newspaper and folded it and set it on top of his hat and picked up his glass. He looked out the painted window, at the diffuse light coming through it, and then he turned and looked at Sample. He had pale eyes to go with the pale skin, a blue so washed out it was nearly gray, and they moved over Sample with a professional inventory, hands, belt line, the set of Sample's shoulders, and registered something and went neutral. "You've been looking at me since you sat down," the pale man said. "Figured I'd save us both the waiting." "I appreciate that," Sample said. "You a lawman?" "No." "You've got the look." "Former," Sample said. "Long former." The pale man nodded, as if this explained something. He picked up his glass. "What do you want?" "I want to know who hired you for the job at the creek crossing," Sample said. "The limestone shelf, 4 miles east of Harrow Flats. 3 days ago." The pale man set his glass down very carefully, the way a man sets something down when his hands need to be free. He looked at Sample with those washed-out eyes, and his right hand moved off the table. "Don't," Sample said. The word was quiet and flat and absolute, and the pale man heard everything that was in it, and his hand stopped where it was, 3 inches off the table edge, over nothing. "I know you were there," Sample said. "I found your casings. I found where your horse stood in the mud on the far bank. I followed the tracks of the boy you didn't finish." He kept his voice even and his eyes on the pale man's eyes. "I'm not the law, and there's no circuit judge coming. This is a conversation between you and me, and what comes out of it depends on what you put into it. Give me the name of the man who contracted you, and we can discuss what happens next." The pale man looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at his glass. Then he did what men in his position almost always do, which is make the wrong calculation. He went for the gun. The cross-draw was fast, Sample gave him that, but it required the man to rotate his body left to clear the holster, and that rotation cost him a half-second he did not have. Sample came out of his chair and got inside the draw and got his left hand on the pale man's wrist before the barrel cleared leather and drove the wrist down against the table edge. The gun discharged into the floor. The pale man's knife came out of somewhere Sample hadn't tracked, left hand, inside the coat, a short-bladed skinner, and caught Sample across the left side, low, the same side the doctor had stitched. And Sample felt the stitches give, and the white-hot line of it, before he got his right elbow up and put it across the pale man's nose with enough force to sit him back in his chair. The pale man's head hit the wall behind him, and he sat there with his eyes going in different directions, and the knife on the floor, and blood coming freely down his lip and chin. The two men at the bar had spun around, and one of them had his hand on his gun, and was looking at Sample trying to determine what he'd just seen. "Private matter," Sample said. He was pressing his left forearm against his side, and the warmth spreading under his shirt told him the doctor's work had not survived the evening. "Sit back down." The man at the bar looked at Sample's face and sat back down. Sample righted his chair and sat across from the pale man, who was blinking now and working on getting his eyes pointed in the same direction. Blood dripped from his chin onto his shirt. "Hollis Crane," Sample said. "Is that the name?" The pale man looked at him with those swimming pale eyes, and something went out of him. The operational part, the part that calculated odds and ran angles. And what was left was just a man sitting in a chair in a saloon in a town he'd stopped in between one bad thing and the next. "Crane," he said. His voice had gone thick and nasal from the broken nose. "Crane's man, anyway. Fellow called Doss. Doss came to me with the contract and the money. Said it came from Crane, but I never met Crane." "How much?" $40 for the three of us. 15 up front. $40. 3 people's lives, 60 sheep, 1 burned wagon, and a boy with a bullet furrow on his arm, all for $40 and a land claim that Hollis Crane needed clear. Sample looked at the pale man and felt something settle in his chest that he recognized and did not argue with. "Where does Doss operate from?" "Don't know. Met him twice. Once when he hired me, once at the crossing." The pale man touched his nose and winced. "He's not from around here. Military bearing. Like an officer who stopped being an officer." "And the third man?" "Red hair. Kid named Teague. He's local. Lives somewhere near Harrow Flats." The pale man looked at Sample with something approaching curiosity. "You're going after Crane." "That's my business," Sample said. "Crane's got money and lawyers and Collis in his pocket, and probably 2 or 3 more men like Doss on a string." He said this without heat, analytically, the way a man with professional experience assesses a problem. "You're one man." "That's been the situation before," Sample said. He stood up and pushed his chair back and put his right hand on the pale man's shoulder and pressed him into his chair with enough force to make the point. "You're going to sit here and finish your drink. You're not going to come out of this building for 1 hour. You do that, and we're square and you ride away from this." The pale man nodded. Sample took his hand away and walked out of Ford's saloon into the cooling evening air and pressed his arm against his side and felt the blood soaking through, and thought about the doctor in Cray with his gut thread and his carbolic and his professional aspirations about keeping wounds dry. He was going to have to find another doctor, or at minimum a clean needle and someone with steady hands. He walked to the dun and untied the reins and stood there for a moment with his forehead against the horse's neck, feeling the animal's warmth and the steadiness of its breathing. Crane. Das. A man named Teague with red hair, who lived somewhere near Harrow Flats. And a boy 6 miles south of Tully Springs, who had his father's jaw and his mother's eyes and could identify all three. Sample straightened up and mounted and turned south. Chapter 4. Clara Esterhuisen sewed him up at her kitchen table with a curved needle, silk thread, and the focused quiet of a woman who had done this kind of thing enough times to have an opinion about the best lighting for it. She had positioned an oil lamp on a short stool to Sample's left and tilted its shade to throw the light directly on his exposed ribs, and she worked without hurrying and without commentary until the third stitch when she said, "Knife." "Knife," Sample confirmed. "This is the same side as the wire." "It is." She tied off the stitch and cut the thread and started the next one. André sat across the table with his arms folded and watched the ceiling, which Clara had apparently decided was the appropriate place for him to direct his attention during the procedure, and he had complied without being told twice. "The boy tells me 3 people," Clara said. "3 people. And you found them?" "I did." She pulled the last stitch tight and tied it and set the needle down on the cloth she'd been using as a tray. She stood back and assessed her work with a critical eye that Sample found more reassuring than a doctor's diploma would have been. "You're going to keep tearing that open," she said, "until you give it 2 weeks of not moving around." "I need about 5 days." "You need 2 weeks. You'll take 5 days." That's the negotiation. She put the needle and thread away in a small wooden box and poured water from the pitcher into the basin and washed her hands. "The boy stays here as long as he needs to." "Thank you, Clara." She turned from the basin. "I'm not done. You're going to eat something before you go anywhere. I don't care what time it is or what the situation is. You're going to sit at this table and eat." She lifted the cloth from a plate she'd set out earlier. Salt beef and boiled potatoes and pickled cabbage from a crock on the shelf. "André, come eat." The boy unfolded his arms and came to the table, and they ate, all 3 of them, Clara included, and nobody said very much. Outside the kitchen window, the night was a flat black with 1 star visible above the ridgeline, and the sound of the cattle in the lower pasture moving slow in the dark. He left before first light. Clara walked him to the barn with a lantern and held it while he saddled the dun, and she did not offer advice or caution because she understood that advice offered to a man already in motion accomplishes nothing. She did press into his saddlebag a folded cloth that contained the rest of the salt beef and 3 cold biscuits and a small bottle of her own distillate that she made from sorghum, and that Sample had sampled before and knew to treat with respect. "The warrant will come," she said, holding the lantern up as he mounted. "Crane has callous. Once Crane knows someone is asking about DOS, the warrant follows the question." Sample had told her the essentials the night before, Clara being one of those people for whom essentials were sufficient and elaboration was an imposition. She had listened and asked 2 questions and then started water boiling for the needle. "I know," he said. "Reyes is the one to watch," she said. "The deputy. He's been in that office 3 years, and he's not the same material as Collis. He won't be easy to read from a distance, but he's worth reading." "How do you know Reyes?" "His sister ranches 20 miles north of here. His sister and I have an understanding about fence lines." She lowered the lantern. "He's a man who took a job he believed in and is watching it go wrong from the inside. Men like that are looking for something to do about it. Sometimes they just need the right circumstance." Sample turned the dun toward the yard gate. "I'll be back for the boy." "I know you will," Clara said. "Don't make it longer than it needs to be." He rode north into the dark. The limestone country began 20 miles north of Claris Ranch, where the scrubland gave way abruptly to a broken terrain of pale rock and shallow canyons and cedar growing in the cracks of things with the grim determination of vegetation that has made its peace with adversity. The canyons ran north to south in parallel cuts, as if something enormous had dragged fingers through the rock at the beginning of time, and between them the ridges stood narrow and flat-topped, 20 feet high in some places, 50 in others, and the road wound through them at the bottom of the cuts where the footing was best and the shade lasted longest. It was country that rewarded the man who knew it, and punished the man who didn't, and Sample did not know it well enough. He had ridden through twice, both times on the main north road, and he knew the general geography, the way the canyons opened and closed, the places where two cuts converged and offered a choice of direction, the spring at the base of the central ridge that ran year-round because it came from deep enough to ignore the August drought. He knew the road. He did not know the ridges. Doss, he suspected, knew the ridges. He had been in the limestone country for 2 hours, the sun high and the shadows gone thin and unhelpful when he picked up the trail. Not hoofprints. The rock surface gave him nothing that specific, but the evidence of recent passage. A cedar branch broken at chest height on a mounted man, the break still showing the pale wet wood inside, a few hours old at most. A tin of something left on a flat rock beside the road, empty, the lid pried back with a knife. Whoever had set camp here recently had not expected to come back to it. He stopped the dun and sat still. No birdsong from the cedar on the ridge to his right. Birds go quiet when something large has disturbed them, and they haven't decided yet what to make of it. The quiet had been there for 5 minutes, and he had registered it without naming it until now. He stepped the dun off the road into the shadow of the left-hand canyon wall and sat with his hand on the rifle in the saddle scabbard and listened to the country. Nothing came. After 10 minutes, the cedars on the right ridge produced a single bird call, and then went back to their ordinary business, and Sample breathed out and rode on, slower now, his eyes on the ridges instead of the road. The warrant caught up with him at the convergence point where the two main canyons met, and the road widened briefly into a flat area of pale dust and loose rock before narrowing again, heading north. 2 riders came in from the eastern canyon mouth at a trot, both wearing the tan star of Collis's office, and they saw Sample at the same moment he saw them and brought their horses up hard. Eldridge Sample, the first one said. He was young, mid-20s, with a clean-shaved face gone red in the heat, and a rifle across his saddle that he was holding at an angle that had not yet committed to anything. "There's a warrant for your arrest out of Harrow Flats. Assault and robbery on a citizen of the county." Sample kept his hands on the saddle horn. "Who's the citizen?" "That's not your concern, right?" "Man named Cale," the second deputy said. The first deputy shot the second one a look. The second deputy was older, 30 or so, with a narrow face under a flat-brimmed hat, and dark eyes that were doing their own assessment of the situation independent of whatever the first one thought he was managing. He sat his horse with the relaxed seat of a man who had spent real time in the saddle, and he held his rifle in a way that was notably neutral, pointing nowhere in particular, balanced across the thighs, not an implied threat. "Deputy Reyes," Sample said. The older man's eyes sharpened slightly. "You know me." "I know of you. I was told you're a man who watches things and thinks about them." "Who told you that?" "A woman with good judgment about people," Sample said. "The warrant is manufactured. Cale was at the creek crossing east of Harrow Flats 4 days ago when a Romanian family was ambushed and killed. Father, mother, grandmother. 3 people. The boy survived. Cale was one of 3 hired guns. He drew on me in a saloon in Pella Ford when I asked him about it." "That's not what the warrant says," the first deputy said. I know what the warrant says, Sample said. He kept his eyes on Reyes. The man who filed the complaint is the same man who paid Cale $40 to kill a family on a homestead claim. The warrant is his way of muddying the trail before I can finish walking it. Reyes said nothing. His face gave nothing away either, but he had not raised his rifle, and he had not moved to flank Sample the way a deputy executing an arrest warrant would move. There's a boy, Sample said. 16. He saw all three men at the crossing, faces and details. He's safe, and I intend to keep him that way. If I'm in your jail, I can't do that. The first deputy said, We have a legal warrant and you're obligated. Hendricks, Reyes said without raising his voice. Hendricks stopped. Reyes looked at Sample for a long moment. A hawk crossed the blue strip of sky above the canyon mouth, moving south unhurried. Who's the boy with? Reyes said. Someone I trust. North of here or south? South. Reyes took that in. He shifted his rifle to his left hand and used his right to bring a folded paper out of his coat. He turned it over once and looked at the seal on it. Then he looked back at Sample. This warrant was filed yesterday afternoon. I was in Collis's office when the rider came in from Morrow with the paperwork. The man who brought it works for a land agent named Cray. I know who he works for. I've been sitting with that information since yesterday afternoon, Reyes said, trying to work out what to do with it. He folded the paper back up. The WesteFLEECED family. The Romanian family. They filed a homestead claim at this office 8 weeks ago. I processed the paperwork myself. Petru Vasile, that was the father's name. He spoke good English, better than he pretended, I think. He wanted to make sure everything was in order. Something shifted in the air of the canyon. Hendricks was looking at Reyes the way a junior man looks at a superior when the superior is doing something the junior can't yet categorize. There's a land office in Morrow, Reyes said. Second floor of the county building. There's a filing drawer in that office labeled with Crane's company name. I have reason to believe that drawer contains paperwork on the Vasile claim, the original deed pages which went missing from the strongbox at the creek crossing. He was watching Sample steadily. That's a statement, not a question. I understand the difference, Sample said. Reyes pocketed the warrant. Hendricks and I rode out this morning on a tip that you were in the limestone country. We've ridden the main canyon and the 2 eastern cuts, and we haven't found you until just now. He gathered his reins. If you were to ride west from here and take the upper canyon road north, you'd bypass the main approaches tomorrow. Rougher going, but the footing is solid. I appreciate the geography, Sample said. There's a man named Doss operating in this country, Reyes said. He came through Harrow Flats 2 weeks ago on Crane's business, and he's been in the limestone since. He's not a man who makes noise. He paused. Be careful in the canyons. Hendricks was staring at Reyes now, with his mouth slightly open. Deputy, Reyes said to him, we've searched the main approach and found nothing. Let's head back and file our report. Hendricks closed his mouth. He looked at Sample once more, and then turned his horse and rode back the way they'd come. Reyes held his position a moment, his dark eyes on Sample. The boy, he said. When this is done, he'll need someone to stand with him if any of it goes in front of a judge. I'll remember that, Sample said. Reyes nodded and rode after Hendricks. Sample sat in the shadow of the canyon wall and listened to the sound of the 2 horses diminish eastward until there was nothing left of them. Then he turned the dun west toward the upper canyon road and rode. He found Doss's camp by the smell of it. Cold camp, no fire, nothing cooking, But Doss had watered his horse at the spring in the central ridge, and the ground around the spring mouth held the mixed scent of horse and man, and the particular alkaline smell of the spring water itself. And Sample caught it 40 yards out riding downwind, and pulled up and stepped off the dun, and led the horse back around the rock face. He tied the dun to a cedar, and went forward on foot. The spring sat in a bowl of rock at the base of the central ridge, fed from a crack in the limestone face that wept water in a thin continuous sheet down to the pool below. The pool was 8 feet across, clear, ringed with the dried mud prints of animals that came here to drink. A man had been sitting at the pool's edge, the packed earth showing the impression of boots and the round mark of a rifle butt where he'd steadied it. He had filled 2 canteens, the cork marks showing in the mud at the water's edge, and then he had moved. Sample crouched at the pool and looked at the boot prints. The heel was squared, military issue or something close to it. The stride, moving away northeast along the base of the ridge, measured long and even, the gait of a man who covered ground without waste. Doss knew he was in the country. Whether he knew it was Sample specifically, or simply that someone was on his trail, the cold camp and the refilled canteens said the same thing. He was moving. Not running, moving. There is a difference, and a man with military bearing understands the difference at the level of the body. Sample went back to the dun, untied him, and led him northeast along the ridge base. For 2 hours, they moved through the limestone country, Sample on foot and leading the horse, reading the ground where it gave him something and reading the air where it didn't. The canyon walls amplified sound in unpredictable ways. A loose stone kicked 20 yards ahead could sound like a rifle report, or could arrive as barely a whisper, depending on the angle of the rock and the direction of the small wind that moved through the cuts in the afternoon. He stopped every 10 minutes and stood still and let the country come to him. On the 3rd stop, he heard the horse. Not moving, breathing. The slow, deep rhythm of a horse standing at rest somewhere above him on the east ridge. He took his time with it, locating the sound against the shape of the ridge and triangulating its position against the cedar growth on the ridgeline. 70 yards, maybe 80, up and to his right. The horse stood near a gap in the cedar where the ridge surface had crumbled and left an irregular notch that would give a man a sightline down into the canyon floor. Sample stood with his hand on the dun's muzzle for 30 seconds. The horse understood and stayed quiet. Then Sample ground hitched the dun in the shadow of a boulder and moved right up the ridge face, using the broken limestone and the cedar growth for cover, angling toward a position that would bring him onto the ridge crest 30 yards north of the notch. It took him 20 minutes to climb what a younger man might have run in 4. The stitches in his side held. He was careful about that. He came over the ridge crest in the shadow of a cedar and lay flat on the rock and looked south along the ridgeline. Doss was in the notch, prone, his rifle laid across a flat shelf of limestone with his cheek against the stock, looking down into the canyon below. He wore the brown flat-brimmed hat from Andre's description. He was compact across the shoulders, built low and dense, and he was absolutely still in the way of men who have learned stillness as a professional discipline. Below him in the canyon, Sample's dun stood ground hitched at the boulder, visible from the notch, apparently abandoned. Doss had set the ambush and was waiting for Sample to walk back to his horse. Sample lay on the ridge crest and looked at the man and thought about his options with the clarity that certain situations impose. He had a rifle in the scabbard on the dun, 70 feet below and 30 yards south, which was not available to him. He had his revolver on his hip. The distance from his position on the crest to the notch was 30 yards of open ridgeline with no cover and poor footing on the loose limestone. He also had the wind, which was running north along the ridge from Doss's position to his. Doss had not heard him come up. Sample picked up a piece of limestone the size of his fist and threw it off the east face of the ridge. It clattered down the far side and hit bottom with a sound like a single rifle shot. Doss moved. He came up out of the prone in one disciplined motion and pivoted east toward the sound, the rifle swinging with him. In that pivot, his back came to Sample for the count of 2. Sample was already moving. He covered the 30 yards of ridgeline at a run, the bad footing costing him half a second, and he hit Doss from behind with his left shoulder before the man had completed his pivot. They went off the west edge of the ridge together, a 4-foot drop to the canyon slope, and hit the loose limestone scree in a tangle. The rifle went one way. Doss tucked and rolled, and came up on his feet with the speed of a man who had practiced falling. He was faster than Sample had allowed for. The first blow caught Sample across the left ear and sent the world sideways. He got his arm up for the second and took it on the forearm and stepped inside it and drove his elbow up into Doss's chin, which rocked the man's head but did not put him down. Doss was solid through the core, built for this, and he set his feet and put both hands on Sample's collar and drove him back into the canyon wall. The rock against his back reopened the stitches. Sample felt it go and noted it and put it aside. He let Doss hold him against the wall for the half-second it took the man to cock his right arm for a finishing blow, and then he dropped straight down and let Doss's fist crack against the limestone where his head had been. In the time it took Doss to register the pain in his hand, Sample came up inside his guard and got both hands into the front of Doss's coat and took 3 fast steps back toward the canyon center and released him. Doss stumbled backward into the open ground of the canyon floor. He caught his balance. His right hand was bleeding across the knuckles from the rock. He looked at Sample with the flat assessment of a man recalibrating. "You're Sample," Doss said. "That's right. Crane will send someone else." "I know it," Sample said. He had his revolver out now, at his side, pointed at the ground between them. "Where's Crane right now?" "This morning, where was he?" Doss looked at the revolver. He looked at Sample's face. He had the soldier's calculation in his eyes, distances, angles, the arithmetic of whether the man with the gun would actually use it. He arrived at a conclusion, and whatever it was, it made him stand very still. "Morrow," Doss said. "He keeps rooms at the Territorial Hotel, north side of the square." "Is he expecting you to report in?" "Not until the job's finished." "Teague," Sample said. "The redhead. Where does he run to?" Something crossed Doss's face. "Teague lives on his mother's place, 2 miles south of Harrow Flats on the Creek Road. Small outfit, a few horses." Sample brought the revolver up to a level position. Doss watched it, and the calculation in his eyes ran through another cycle. "I'm not going to kill you," Sample said. "I need you alive and able to answer questions in front of a judge. That's the plan. But if you ride for Morrow tonight and put Crane on a fast horse, the plan changes." He held Doss's eyes. "Do you understand the distinction I'm making?" "I understand it. Your rifle is back up on the ridge. Your horse is north of the spring, I'd guess. You can collect both of them. But you ride south. You go somewhere nobody from Crane's operation knows about, and you stay there for 5 days." Doss studied him. "And if I don't?" "Then the plan changes," Sample said again, and left it there, which was enough. Doss looked down at his bleeding hand and flexed the fingers, testing the joints. Satisfied that nothing was broken, he looked back at Sample. The calculation had resolved itself into something that read less like compliance and more like a professional reading of the board. A man who understood that his position had deteriorated past the point of recovery and was adjusting accordingly. "South," Doss said. "South," Sample said. Doss walked north up the canyon to find his horse. Sample watched him until the canyon bent and took him out of sight, then waited another 5 minutes. No sound of hooves heading north toward Morrow. He went up the ridge face, slower this time and more deliberate, and retrieved Doss's rifle from the notch, a Springfield military issue, the stock worn smooth from long use, and brought it down and tied it across his own saddle. His shirt was wet through on the left side. He unbuttoned it and looked at Clara's stitches and found 2 of the 5 had pulled loose and the wound had opened across a 1-inch section. He pressed his bandana against it and held it there for 2 minutes, and then buttoned the shirt over it and mounted the gun. North. Toward Morrow. Toward a man named Hollis Crane, who kept rooms at the Territorial Hotel on the north side of the square, and who had spent 3 years acquiring land and extinguishing the people who stood in the way of acquiring more of it, all of it done from a distance, none of it traceable to a single paper trail, all of it arriving now at a limestone canyon in the late afternoon where a man with torn stitches and a borrowed rifle was the sum total of what stood between Crane and a clean resolution. Sample thought about Reyes, about the filing drawer in the county building in Morrow with Crane's company name on it, about Andre at Clara's table, eating what was put in front of him, the laudanum bottle untouched in his pocket. He thought about Petru Vasilei's hand in the shallow water of the creek, the fingers trailing in the current. He rode north. Chapter 5. Morrow at night was a different town than Morrow in daylight, which Sample counted on. The county seat carried itself with the groomed self-importance of a place that has government in it. A wide square, gas street lamps along the main face, a 2-story courthouse with columns that someone had believed in strongly enough to ship from somewhere that had columns to spare. In daylight, those columns announced themselves. At 9 in the evening, they stood in shadow, and the square belonged to the moths circling the street lamps and the 3 horses tied in front of the Silver King Saloon, and a dog moving alone along the far side of the square on private business. Sample came into Morrow from the west, on a road that entered town between the livery and a grain warehouse, and deposited him at the southwest corner of the square without passing in front of anything that had windows facing the right direction. He had planned this on the ride north, working the geography from memory, and the town had cooperated. He tied the dun at the livery rail, and went inside, and paid for a stall and water, and told the nightman, a boy of about 14 who had been sleeping on a hay bale, and came awake with the alertness of someone accustomed to being roused at inconvenient hours to give the horse grain and leave the saddle on. The Territorial Hotel sat on the north side of the square, 4 stories of dark brick with a covered gallery along the ground floor, and gas lamps burning at the entrance. A man in a coat sat behind the desk in the lobby, reading, and looked up when Sample came in from the street. "Hollis Crane," Sample said. "What room?" The desk man took in Sample's state, the trail grime, the left side of his shirt dark and stiff where the blood had dried again, the general presentation of a man who had come a long distance for a specific purpose and made a rapid series of decisions. "Mr. Crane is a long-term guest. I'm not at liberty to—" "I'm not asking you to take me up," Sample said. "I'm asking for the room number." He set $2 on the desk and left his hand over it. "Mr. Crane is expecting news from the field tonight. I'm the news." The desk man looked at the hand on the money. "Room 14, he said. "2nd floor, east side." Sample took his hand away and left the money and went up the stairs. He stood in the 2nd floor corridor, outside room 14, and listened. Lamplight under the door. The sound of a chair on a wood floor. The small percussion of a glass set on a hard surface. Someone awake and at a desk or a table. He knocked. Yes. A voice with substance in it. The baritone of a man accustomed to being heard in large rooms. "Telegram," Sample said. A pause. Then the sound of the chair again, and footsteps crossing the floor, and the door opened. Hollis Crane was not what the name had prepared Sample to expect, which was a point in Crane's favor, and which Sample noted. He had expected the lean, predatory type, the sharp-faced land speculator from a dozen bad novels he'd never read, but somehow absorbed anyway. What stood in the doorway was a man of 50 or so, broad through the chest and running to heaviness at the waist, with a large, well-shaped head and gray hair worn slightly long, and a face that had been handsome in its youth and had settled into something more useful, which was authoritative. He wore good trousers and a collarless shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and slippers on his feet, and he held a glass of something amber in his left hand. And the first thing he did upon registering that Sample was not a telegraph boy was assess the situation with the practiced speed of a man who had navigated difficult conversations his entire professional life and knew how they begin. "You're not from the hotel," Crane said. "No." "Are you going to tell me who you are?" "Eldridge Sample." Something moved across Crane's face and settled. He stepped back from the door and gestured inside with the hand that held the glass. The gesture was unhurried and almost cordial, and it told Sample more about Crane than anything that followed. This was a man who responded to the unexpected by expanding, not contracting. A man who had spent 40 years turning disadvantageous situations into negotiations. Sample went in. The room was large by hotel standards, with a writing desk against the east wall, covered in neat stacks of paper, and a lamp burning bright over it. A leather traveling case stood open on the luggage stand. The window overlooked the square, and the gaslight from below came through it, and laid a long yellow rectangle across the floorboards. Sample moved to put the window behind him, and his back to the wall beside the wardrobe, and Crane watched him do this with an expression that acknowledged the tactic without being troubled by it. Crane went to the desk chair and sat, crossing one leg over the other and setting his glass on the desk beside a neat stack of ledgers. He looked at Sample with the steady appraisal of a man deciding how much he needs to spend to resolve a problem. "I know your name," Crane said. "You were a Marshal, Tulsa office. You had a reputation for thoroughness that your superiors found inconvenient. You left the service under circumstances that a creative prosecutor could describe in several different ways. He let that settle. I have a man on retainer who locates that kind of information. He's very good." "I don't doubt it," Sample said. "Then you understand that any account you attempt to give of recent events in this county can be complicated by that history. A jury hears that a man left federal service under a cloud, it colors everything that comes after." Crane picked up his glass and turned it once in his fingers. "A man in your position might reasonably conclude that pursuing this particular matter to any formal conclusion is not in his interest." "A man in my position," Sample said. "I'm offering you a way out of this that doesn't cost you anything. You've done nothing here that can't be overlooked, provided you're reasonable about what comes next." Crane's voice held no menace. It held the tone of a man explaining the terms of a contract to someone who hadn't read the fine print. "You're not from this county. You have no stake in the land question here. Whatever brought you into this situation, it needn't follow you out of it." "A family," Sample said. "That's what brought me in. Romanian family, name of Vasile. Father, mother, grandmother. 3 days out of Harrow Flats on a homestead claim, which they had a legal right to, and which you needed voided." Crane set his glass down. He recrossed his legs and considered Sample with an expression that was moving slowly from negotiation toward something else. "I don't know what you've been told, or by whom, but—" "The man who hired the shooters is named Doss," Sample said. "He was operating under your direction. He hired a man named Cale, and a local boy named Teague to complete the job. Cale is the one who fired from the far bank. He had custom .44 to 40 loads, hand-loaded by an operator in Tule Springs named Birch, who keeps a record of his clientele, whether he admits it or not. Doss managed the contract and positioned the men. Sample's voice stayed level. The WesteFLEECED deed pages came out of the strongbox at the creek crossing after the family was dead. They're in a filing drawer in the county land office downstairs, second floor of the building across the square, labeled with your company name. Crane was very still. The boy survived, Sample said. The WesteFLEECED boy. He saw all three men. He can put Cale and Doss and Teague at that creek crossing, and he will, in front of whoever needs to hear it. A child's testimony, Crane said. A foreign child. A 16-year-old witness who dressed his own gunshot wound and kept his head and remembered every face, Sample said. In front of a territorial judge, that testimony, combined with the deed papers in your filing drawer and Birch's records, and whatever is in those ledgers on your desk, which I intend to take with me tonight, will be more than sufficient. He moved from the wall toward the desk, 2 steps, stopping at a distance that required Crane to look up at him. You ordered the killing of 3 people for a water source and 40 acres of creek-bottom land. I want you to say that plainly. This is not a courtroom, Crane said. No, Sample said. It isn't. Say it anyway. Crane looked at him for a long moment. Outside the window, the square was quiet. One of the horses at the Silver King had shifted, and its bridle rang once against the hitch rail and went silent. The WesteFLEECED claim interfered with a water rights consolidation that represents 3 years of legitimate investment, Crane said. His voice had changed register, not louder but stripped of its professional smoothness, something harder underneath. The family was compensated, offered fair market value for the claim, and told to look elsewhere. They refused. They were informed of the difficulties they could expect, and they refused again. He stood up from the chair, and standing he was a large man, and he used the size deliberately. What happened at that creek was a consequence of their own obstinacy. I gave instructions that the matter be resolved. I did not specify the method. You gave instructions, Sample said. To Doss. To my representative, yes. And Doss understood what resolve meant. That's between Doss and his conscience. You paid $40 for 3 lives, Sample said. I want that on the record, too. You have no record, Crane said. He moved his right hand toward the inside of his coat, the move beginning as a gesture, something a man makes when he's about to produce a document or adjust his clothing, and Sample watched it the way he had watched 10,000 small moves in 11 years of law work and 2 more years of work without the badge. Don't, Sample said. Crane's hand stopped. From the corridor outside came the sound of a boot on the floorboard, a single deliberate step, and then the door opened and Deputy Reyes came in with his hat in his hand and his rifle at his side, and his dark eyes moving from Crane to Sample and back to Crane. Crane looked at Reyes. He looked at the door, which Reyes now stood in front of. He looked at Sample. The large, authoritative face reorganized itself through several expressions in rapid succession, and arrived at something that was not quite defeat, and not quite composure, and occupied the space between them where a man stands when he understands that the negotiation is over. I've been in the corridor since you knocked, Reyes said to Sample. I heard what I needed to hear. The ledgers, Sample said. Reyes crossed to the desk and picked up the top 2 ledgers and looked at the spines and set one back and kept the other. He picked up a second one from beneath it. He opened it, looked at 2 pages, and closed it. These, he said. There's a filing drawer in the county land office, Sample said. 2nd floor. I know the one. Reyes set the ledgers under his left arm. He looked at Crane. "Mr. Crane, you'll stay in this room tonight. I'm going to lock this door from the outside, and I'll be in the lobby until morning. In the morning, I'm going to ride to the territorial capital and present what I have to the governor's office directly." He said this without heat or satisfaction, the way a man recites a procedure he has thought through carefully and arrived at deliberately. "I'm not going to Collis. I'm not going to the county prosecutor. I'm going over both of them, and given the nature of what's in these ledgers, I expect they'll have their own concerns to manage before long." Crane sat back down in the desk chair. He picked up his glass and held it. "I'll have 3 lawyers here by morning," he said. "That's your right," Reyes said. "I'd start sending telegrams now if I were you. It's a long ride to the capital." He gestured at Sample with his chin, and they went out. Reyes locked the door from the outside with a key from his coat and pocketed it. In the corridor, they stood for a moment in the low lamplight. "The filing drawer," Sample said. "I'll go now, tonight. The county clerk owes me a favor, and his house is 2 blocks from here." Reyes tucked the ledgers more securely under his arm. He looked at Sample's side, at the dark stain on his shirt that had spread during the conversation. "You need a doctor." "I need to go south," Sample said. Reyes looked at him with those dark level eyes. "The Vasile claim," he said. "Without the original deed pages, it gets complicated. With them, and with the water rights survey from Meridian that I assume got filed." "Yesterday evening," Sample said. "Fenn saw to it." Reyes nodded. "Then the claim stands. The boy is the surviving heir. He can file a probate declaration at this office, the county recorder, not the land office, and with the deed pages as evidence, the homestead transfers to him cleanly." He paused. "It'll take some months to work through, but it'll hold." "He'll need someone in the county who knows how the paperwork moves," Sample said. "He'll have that," Reyes said. He offered his hand. Sample took it. Teague was easier than Sample had any right to expect, and he had made peace with the possibility that he was wrong about Teague before he rode out to the creek road south of Harrow Flats in the early morning. A man who holds horses during a killing and watches a boy ride away and does nothing is a man who may have ridden into something he did not fully understand when he agreed to it. This was not an excuse. It was a distinction, and Sample had learned over many years to keep his distinctions clean. The Teague place was a narrow operation between the creek and a limestone bluff, a house that needed paint, a corral with 4 horses, a barn that was in better shape than the house, which said something about the family's priorities. The horses were good stock, well kept, and they raised their heads when Sample rode in from the road and watched him with the intelligent attention of animals that have been handled correctly. Teague came out of the barn. He was younger than Sample had imagined from Andre's description, 22, 23 at most, and the red hair was exactly as described, vivid in the morning light, the color of new copper before weather gets to it. He was lean and long-armed, and he had the look of a young man who had recently done something that had fundamentally altered his understanding of himself. And he carried that alteration in the set of his jaw and in the way his eyes went from Sample to the road behind Sample and back to Sample. He did not go for the rifle, leaning against the barn door. Sample noted this. "You know who I am," Sample said from the saddle. Teague looked at him steadily. "I heard there was a man asking." "Then you know what I'm asking about." The young man's jaw tightened. He looked at the horses in the corral. He had the red man's complexion, the kind that shows everything, embarrassment and cold and the particular pallor of guilt. And his face right now was doing several things at once. "I didn't know it was going to go that far," he said. Doss said it was a warning. Ride them off the road, fire some rounds, send them back the way they came. He swallowed. It wasn't that. No, Sample said. It wasn't. I held the horses. I didn't fire. You held the horses, Sample said. There's a 16-year-old boy who will stand in front of a judge and tell exactly what he saw, and what he saw was 3 men at that crossing. Your position in the group, and what you did or didn't fire, is for a jury to weigh. He let that sit. Or you ride tomorrow today, and you make a statement to a deputy named Reyes. You tell him everything Doss told you before the job, and everything you saw at the crossing. All of it honest, nothing held back. He watched the young man. Those are your choices. Teague looked at the horses again for a long time. Doss paid me $8, he said, mostly to himself. Sample said nothing to that. Reyes, Teague said. At the sheriff's office. Reyes will be back in Harrow Flats by tomorrow morning. You can find him there. Sample picked up the Dunn's reins. Go today. He rode back out to the road and turned south toward Claris Ranch, toward Andre, and he did not look back at the Teague place. Whether the young man saddled a horse and rode tomorrow or saddled a horse and rode in the opposite direction was something Sample could not control and had decided not to carry. He had offered the choice. The choice belonged to Teague now, and to whatever Teague found when he looked at himself. Clara met him at the gate with a look that covered the distance between relief and irritation without settling on either. You need those stitches redone, she said. I know it. Come inside. Andre was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a map that Clara had spread out for him, a county map hand-drawn, with the Creek Valley marked and the homestead claim boundary sketched in pencil in Clara's precise hand. He looked up when Sample came in, and his eyes went to Sample's side and then to Sample's face, and he read what was there the way he read everything, carefully and in full. Crane, the boy said. In a room in Morrow with a locked door, Sample said. Reyes has the ledgers and the deed pages. The water rights survey went through. The claim stands in your name. Andre looked at the map. There'll be paperwork, Sample said. Months of it. Reyes will help you navigate the county recorder. Clara can put you in contact with a lawyer in Cray who handles homestead work and won't rob you. He pulled out a chair and sat across from the boy, his side complaining steadily, the kind of deep bone ache that comes from a wound that has been torn open twice. The land is yours. Your father filed the claim correctly. That part is done. The boy's hands on the map were his father's hands, broad across the palm, the fingers square and practical. He had the gold wedding band from Petru Vasilei's finger on a cord around his own neck, which Sample had not known until now, and he touched it once without seeming aware that he did. I'll need to go back, Andre said. To the crossing. To bury them properly. Yes. Will you come? It was not a question in the usual sense. Sample looked at the boy for a moment, and at the map and at the cord around his neck. Yes, he said. After Clara fixes this side. Clara was already at the wooden box with the needle. They buried the Vasileis on the homestead claim, not at the creek crossing. Andre had decided this during the 2 days it took Sample's side to stabilize enough for the ride, and he had explained his reasoning to Sample once, simply. His father had spent 2 years saving the passage money, and 6 months on a boat, and 3 months learning the county land records from a man in a Chicago church basement who helped new arrivals understand the Homestead Act. And he had done all of that to reach a particular piece of ground, and that ground was where he should rest. Sample had said nothing except that it made sense. They wrapped the 3 of them in canvas from Clara's supply, proper canvas, not a bedroll, and transported them on the wagon bed of a neighbor Clara had called in, a quiet man named Hofer who asked no questions and handled the work with the deliberate respect of someone who understood what he was part of. The homestead sat at the east end of the creek valley, where the water bent south, and the cottonwoods thinned, and the land opened into a broad south-facing bench of grass and deep soil that caught the morning sun for 6 hours before the bluff behind it took over. It was good land. Sample had said so the first time he rode through the valley, and he saw it again now, and the seeing of it did something complicated in his chest that he did not try to simplify. He and Hofer dug the graves, while André stood at the edge of the bench and looked at the ground he had inherited. Bunika's rosary, reassembled on a new cord, the beads that Sample had collected from the grass at the crossing and kept in his breast pocket since, went into the ground with her. The blue letter from the strong box went with Marta. Petru Vasile went into the ground with his boots on and the deed to the claim tucked inside his coat, which was André's idea and which Sample executed without comment. There was no minister. André spoke in Romanian over each of them, something short and direct, and then stood for a while in silence. Sample stood with his hat off. Hofer did the same. The creek ran in the valley below them with its small private sound, and a red-tailed hawk rode a thermal above the bluff, and the late summer grass moved in a wind that came from the west with the first cool suggestion of what was behind it. When André was done, he picked up a shovel and helped fill the graves, and they finished the work without ceremony. Sample stayed 3 more days, which was 2 more than he had planned, and 1 less than Clara recommended. He slept in the barn and ate at Clara's table, and on the 2nd day he rode out to the homestead alone and walked the claim boundary the way Petru Vasile had presumably walked it in his mind 1,000 times on the passage over, measuring it against the document, understanding what it could carry and what it couldn't, what it would need in its first year and what could wait. The bench above the creek would take a house. The lower ground along the water would graze 30 sheep easily, 60 if the winter was fair. There was a spring on the north end of the claim that Sample found by following the greenness in the grass, working its way up from the ground in a seep that widened into a solid flow after 3 feet of digging with his boot heel. He told André about the spring that evening. The boys sat with it quietly. Then he said, "My father would have found it himself. He always found the water." "I believe that," Sample said. On the morning of the 3rd day, Sample saddled the dun and tied his gear and came to breakfast and ate with Clara and André and drank 2 cups of coffee, and when he pushed back from the table, André looked at him across the plates. "You won't take money," the boy said. "No. I thought not." He reached into his coat and brought out something small and set it on the table between them. It was a brass button, a good one with an embossed design that Sample couldn't make out from where he sat, something floral or possibly a bird. It was my father's, from his coat in the old country. He carried it in his pocket on the passage and gave it to me when we reached New York because he said it meant we had arrived and the old country was behind us and we didn't need to carry it anymore. André pushed it across the table. "I think you should have it." Sample looked at the button on the table. He picked it up. A bird, he could see now, wings spread, 1 leg raised, the posture of something in the moment of lifting off. He turned it over. Plain brass on the back, a small loop soldered on for thread. He put it in his breast pocket, where the rosary beads had been. Clara walked him to the gate. She did not say anything, and he did not say anything, which between them meant everything necessary had been said already. He mounted and turned west, and then paused and looked back at the house. André stood in the yard with his arms at his sides. He was going to be a large man when he finished growing. He had his father's frame and the particular straight posture of someone who has decided, recently and at considerable cost, the kind of person he intends to be. He held Sample's eyes for a moment, and then raised one hand, a single gesture, palm forward. Sample touched his hat brim and rode. He took the eastern road out of the creek valley, and rode toward the homestead claim, and the bench above the water, and when he came around the bluff he pulled up. The sheep were there. Not all of them. Nothing close to 60, but a dozen or more had found their way back to the valley in the 2 weeks since the crossing, drawn by the water and the grass and whatever logic governs the movement of animals that have been set loose in familiar terrain and allowed to simply be. They moved across the bench in the morning light with the unhurried purpose of animals that have decided this is where they are. Their fleece gone rough from the weeks unattended, but their condition better than Sample had expected, the grass having done for them what grass does. He sat the dun on the bluff road and watched them for a while. Then he heard the horse behind him and turned. Andre was coming up the road on the brown mare, moving at a trot, his dark hair loose in the morning wind. He pulled up beside Sample and looked out at the bench and the sheep, and whatever crossed his face in that moment he kept private, which was his right. "I need to get them back in," he said. "You do," Sample said. The boy put his heels to the mare and rode down onto the bench. The sheep lifted their heads at the sound of the hooves, and then settled and went back to their grazing and let him ride among them. And he began moving them east along the bench toward the lower ground near the creek where the grass was thicker and the water was close, working them with the patient geometry of someone who had learned this from someone who had learned it before him. Sample watched until the boy had the animals moving in the right direction, and the morning light was full on the valley, and the creek was a bright line below the bench, and then he turned the dun west and rode. He did not look back. The end.